I now look to Mark Lyall Grant to continue the case for the opposition.
Thank you, Madam President, for the invitation to participate in this important debate. So one day, the UN Secretary General proposes that in the interests of global peace and harmony, the world's best footballers should get together and form a UN football team. And his deputy says, jolly good idea, but who will we play against? And he replies, well, Israel, of course. Now, this is a classic American joke about the United Nations. And it's easy to knock the UN. And we've heard already this evening about some of the many failures of the UN. Charles Petrie read out from the most noble preamble to the UN Charter about saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war, supporting fundamental human rights, equal rights of men and women. All those great things, the noble purpose of the United Nations. Has it lived up to that noble purpose? No, of course it hasn't. Should we therefore say we write the UN off? I was British ambassador to the United Nations for more than 5 years. And incidentally, the only one of the visiting speakers tonight who hasn't been on the UN payroll. So I'm in a good position to recognize the many weaknesses of the United Nations and know the frustrations of how difficult it is to get anything done at or through the United Nations. But is that really surprising when you think of the different interests of the 193 members of the United Nations? What has China, with 1.4 billion population, got in common with Tuvalu, which has 11,000 people? What has Qatar, the richest country in the world at $128,000 per head, got in common with the Central African Republic at $700 per head? What has the United States, which spends $700 billion on defense, got in common with Costa Rica, which doesn't have an army at all? Now, I have sat in dozens of UN Security Council meetings on Syria, on Libya, on Ukraine, on Yemen, on Israel, Palestine, the Democratic Republic of Congo, without being able to resolve those conflicts. Sometimes because of vetoes, Russian vetoes often, occasionally American vetoes, and sometimes because the United Nations simply doesn't have the tools to be able to impose peace on warring parties. But the credit sheet of the United Nations is also very significant. Arguably the UN has succeeded in its central purpose of helping to avoid a third world war. You may be surprised to hear that in the last 10 years, there have been fewer global conflict deaths than in any decade for 150 years back in the 1860s. And look beyond peace and security at the other two key pillars of the United Nations, development and human rights. Because the UN is a vast family of funds, programs, and agencies, which provides food for 80 million people in 80 countries, helps more than 36 million refugees, vaccinates 45 million children every year, mobilizes $25 billion in support of those damaged by hurricanes and other natural disasters. And these are not just numbers. This is the difference between life and death for millions of unfortunate people around the world. And in recent years also, the UN has some very significant achievements. It facilitated the first ever arms trade treaty to regulate for the very first time the trade in conventional weapons. It facilitated, of course, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals Agreement that we've heard about. The WHO, the World Health Organization, at the moment is leading the international response to the coronavirus. Now, you may say, and the opposition, of course, will say, that have we actually closed down the conventional arms trade? Have we actually abolished poverty? Have we defeated the coronavirus? No, of course, we haven't done those things. but the agreements that the UN has facilitated have provided an important first step in tackling them. Now, I could cite many more examples like that, but I want to step back for a moment and make three fundamental points that I would like you to consider this evening. The first is that the United Nations is the only forum in which all 193 countries in the world come together. You know, there might be 150 embassies in Washington, 130, say, in London, but in New York, every single country is there. That wasn't always the case. You know, Switzerland only joined the United Nations in 2002. But now, the first thing that all new countries do is apply for UN membership. Why? Because they see it as the critical forum for their international interactions. So if it didn't exist, clearly we would have to invent it. And that proximity of all the countries being in New York does foster real cooperation and not just the illusion of cooperation. You know, we were hammering the Russians in the Security Council in the morning on Ukraine and Syria, but we were still cooperating with the Russians in the afternoon on combating piracy and on counterterrorism. You can do both at the same time. The second point is that the United Nations is only ever going to be as strong as the 193 countries want it to be. It is not like the European Union. It is an intergovernmental body that does not have any independent legal personality of its own. So it is true, and I readily admit it, that the big powers can always frustrate action if they feel that their national interests are at stake. And we see that with Russia on Ukraine and Syria. We see it with China on the South China Sea. We see it with the United States on Israel and Palestine. We see it with India on Kashmir. And dare I say it, we see it with the United Kingdom on the Chagos Islands. But the UN can ensure that there is a price to be paid for that blockage, if only in the court of public opinion. Because in all the UN bodies except the UN Security Council, China and Tuvalu have the same status and the same one vote. And that is the reason that the biggest supporters of the United Nations system are the 105 small countries around the world with populations of less than 5 million, because they see the UN as their only protection against a return to the lawless days of might means right. And thirdly, the reason that the UN has survived, and indeed in many cases thrived over the last 75 years, is that unlike the League of Nations in the 1930s, all the major powers have willingly joined the organization, thereby accepting the need for international cooperation. You know, right-wing commentators in the United States, like Rush Limbaugh, say that the purpose of the United Nations is to separate America from its money. Well, America still participates, even under the current administration, in the UN system. And yes, of course, some compromises have been made to allow this to happen, in particular, the veto power. But surely that is a price worth paying to avoid the UN breaking up as the League of Nations broke up in the 1930s. So even the most unilateral of countries, and in my diplomatic experience, the three most unilateral countries in the world are Russia, America, and India, even they accept that they need to submit to some form of international oversight and monitoring through the UN system on their international actions, which in this increasingly populist, demagogic, nationalistic world, surely we should be thankful for that fact. So if you are an idealist and you genuinely believe in world government, such as H.G. Wells wrote about 100 years ago, or you see the Star Trek Council doing on the television, then by all means support this motion, you're going to be disappointed by the UN. But if, like Dag Hammarskjöld, you think that the UN was set up not to take us to heaven, but to save us from hell, if you are a realist or a potential practitioner like me, then thank your lucky stars that the UN exists to offer some sort of constraint on the unbridled nationalism that we've seen for the previous several hundred years, and vote against this proposition this evening. Thank you very much.